Mom said this coin belongs to our dad.
No, that can't be true.
Denver, winter. Alexander Carter, a powerful CEO who once walked away from love, steps into swirling snow. Two small boys shiver by the curb, selling papers. A cap drops. In his hand, a bent silver coin from college, his old initials. His breath stops. If this coin is theirs, what truth waits in the storm, and will he run again or finally stay? The snow started before noon, a steady sift that turned Denver's glass towers into pale ghosts. From the corner office on the 53rd floor, Alexander Carter watched the city blur and felt nothing. People noticed him before he spoke: tall frame, deep blue eyes, dark brown hair touched with elegant gray and swept to the side, a strong jaw that cameras loved. His navy suit was sharp, his red tie bright against a white shirt. He knew the hour by the heat in the vents and the muted ping of his calendar. Fourth quarter was a parade of closings and quiet acquisitions. Finance and real estate kept him moving, kept him important. It did not keep him warm. Donna, his chief of staff, stood in the doorway with a tablet. Investors confirmed for tomorrow at 9. The Aspen Resort vote is on track. Good, he said. You'll need an early car if the road's ice. I'll walk to clear my head, he answered, though he knew the driver would be waiting anyway. She hesitated. It's your birthday, Alexander. He looked down at the pen in his hand. Is it? I can cancel dinner if you want. Leave it, he said. When she left, the office swallowed the quiet again. He opened a small leather box he rarely touched. The lining held a coin-shaped depression and nothing else. He traced the circle with one finger and saw a campus blanketed in the first snow, saw a younger man laughing as he pressed a bent silver coin into a girl's palm. Why is it bent? Julia had asked, breath fogging the air. So it will never roll away from you, he had said. Like me. She tucked the coin into her pocket and leaned her forehead to his. Promise. Promise, he whispered, believing himself. Years later, in his New York apartment, she stood with her hands shaking. I'm pregnant. He remembered the distance between them, a cruel country he built in a breath. He remembered the words that served his fear and ruined everything. I don't want to be a father. She stared as if the floor had opened. You don't mean that. He meant it then, or he thought he did. She left with the coat on her shoulders and the bent coin in her pocket. He told himself she would be fine. That ambition could not share space with a crib. Evening softened the office lights. Snow pressed harder against the glass. He closed the empty box and set it back. His reflection hovered in the window, tall and composed and deeply alone. His phone buzzed. Dana again. Driver in the garage. Side entrance is cleared. He answered with one word. Thanks. In the elevator's mirrored walls, the man in the navy suit seemed carved from frost. He watched the numbers count down and kept his hands still at his sides. The lobby breathed warm air. A security guard nodded. Stay safe out there, Mr. Carter. You too, Alexander said. Outside, the city sounded different under snow. Muted horns, careful footsteps, the whisper of tires. He should have taken the car. Instead, he turned his collar up and walked, letting the air bite his cheeks. The distance from his tower to the street felt like a descent he had postponed for years. He passed a storefront where a family gathered around a small cake. A boy clapped and someone sang, off-key and happy. Alexander paused, listening through the glass. He kept moving. In his pocket, his hand closed, by habit, on nothing at all. The shape of the missing coin lived there anyway, a small, stubborn ache. He thought of the promise he broke, of the life he refused, of the woman who disappeared into winter with his word in her pocket. Snow gathered on his shoulders. For the first time in a long time, he felt the weather not as an inconvenience, but as a truth, cold, honest, and impossible to ignore. Snow fell heavier as evening settled over downtown Denver. Alexander Carter adjusted the collar of his navy overcoat. his polished shoes crunching against slush as he exited the marble lobby of Carter Financial Holdings. His reflection in the glass doors looked every bit the powerful man the city whispered about. A strikingly handsome CEO with deep blue eyes, strong square jawline, and hair dark with just enough elegant gray to command respect. Yet inside, there was no warmth, only a silence that trailed him like a shadow. He walked briskly down the crowded street, eager to leave behind the suffocating day of board meetings and endless numbers. But then, he slowed. Just ahead, near the corner of Colfax Avenue, two small figures huddled beneath a flickering street lamp. Their jackets were thin, their gloves mismatched, their breath curling in pale puffs against the cold. One boy held a stack of newspapers, too large for his small hands. The other bent low, fishing empty bottles from a recycling bin, his face red from the bitter air. Their shoes were soaked, laces undone, toes pushing against frayed seams. "Newspaper, sir? Only a dime," the older one called, his voice trembling more from cold than courage. Alexander's gaze caught theirs for only a moment. Two pairs of wide, weary eyes, and then he looked away. His stride lengthened, the instinct to move past tightening in his chest. This city had countless children on countless corners. It wasn't his problem. He had long ago taught himself not to look too closely. But something in that voice, that desperate politeness, tugged at him. He hesitated mid-step. The younger boy stumbled, nearly dropping the bag of bottles, and his wool cap slipped to the ground. He scrambled to pick it up, but the wind caught it, pushing it toward the curb. Alexander, almost against his own will, bent down first. His gloved hand closed around the cap, rough wool damp against his palm. He turned, ready to hand it back, and froze. The boy stood clutching a coin in his fist, turning it nervously as if for comfort. A small, bent silver coin. Even dulled by time, Alexander knew it instantly. His breath faltered. That coin. The initials faintly scratched on its surface. The one he had given Julia all those years ago, the night she whispered she was pregnant. The world narrowed. The snow, the lights, the honking traffic, all fell silent beneath the pounding in his ears. "Where did you get this?" His voice cracked, betraying something raw he hadn't let out in years. The boy looked up, wary but honest. "It was Mom's," he said softly. "She said it belonged to our father." Alexander's throat tightened. He couldn't move. The bent coin burned in his sight, and for the first time in decades, the walls he'd built around his heart began to splinter. The boy pulled the cap back over his ears and hurried to join his brother, unaware of the storm he had just awakened. Alexander remained on the sidewalk, snow stinging his face, but none of it compared to the fire rising inside him. Because in that bent coin, he saw not only the past he had abandoned, he saw the truth staring back at him. And the truth was alive, standing in the snow, calling him Father without even knowing his name. Alexander stood frozen on the icy sidewalk, the world around him blurring into white noise. The bent silver coin in the boy's hand felt like a ghost from another lifetime. His chest rose and fell sharply, each breath cutting like glass. The boys darted away toward another block, eager to sell the last of their newspapers before nightfall. Alexander remained rooted, his polished shoes sinking into slush. His mind screamed at him to move, to call out, but his throat refused sound. He hadn't felt this powerless since the night Julia walked away. At last, he forced himself forward. "Wait, boys!" His voice rang against the stone walls, startling passers-by. The older child glanced back, wary, clutching his brother's arm. Their eyes widened at the sight of the tall man striding toward them in a navy overcoat, red tie bright against the storm. Alexander slowed, not wanting to scare them. He crouched slightly, meeting their gaze. His voice was unsteady. "That coin. Where did your mother get it?" The older boy's lips tightened. She said it belonged to our dad, that he gave it to her before he left. His small hand curled protectively around his brother's shoulder. Why do you care? Snowflakes clung to Alexander's dark hair as he swallowed hard. Because I know that coin. I gave it to someone I loved a long time ago. The younger boy frowned. Then maybe you're him. The words cut deeper than any boardroom battle ever had. Alexander's pulse thundered in his ears. He wanted to tell them yes, to claim them in that instant. But the weight of years and lies pressed down on his tongue. Before he could answer, a bus rumbled past, spraying icy water onto the curb. The boys flinched and pulled away. "We have to go," the older one said quickly. "Mom's waiting." They turned, darting into the crowd, their figures swallowed by the storm. Alexander reached out, his hand trembling in the frigid air. "Wait!" But the snow muffled his call, and soon they were gone. For several moments he stood motionless, the bent coin's image seared into his mind. He felt as if the city had shifted beneath him, exposing a fault line he had ignored for too long. He pulled his phone from his coat pocket, fingers stiff from cold. "Dana," he said when his chief of staff answered. His voice was low, urgent. "Find me a private investigator, tonight." A pause crackled through the line. "Of course, Mr. Carter. May I ask?" "Don't ask," he snapped, then softened, pressing a hand to his forehead. "Just make it discreet. No one can know." When the call ended, Alexander leaned against a lamppost, snow piling at his polished shoes. He closed his eyes, seeing Julia's face, the way she had looked at him the night he told her he didn't want to be a father. Shame pressed heavy against his ribs. The streets bustled with holiday lights and hurried shoppers, but Alexander Carter, master of towers and empires, felt stripped to the bone. Two boys with weary eyes had cracked open the vault of his past, and in their small hands was the proof he could never ignore. As he turned back toward his skyscraper, his reflection in the frosted glass seemed like that of a stranger. For the first time in decades, Alexander Carter was not certain of who he really was. And somewhere in the storm, the answer lay with Julia, and with the two boys who might very well be his sons. Snow swirled harder as Alexander pushed through the revolving doors of his skyscraper headquarters. The warmth of the marble lobby did little to thaw the chill gripping his chest. His assistant, Dana, glanced up from the security desk, startled at his return. "Mr. Carter, did you forget something?" He shook his head, voice tight. "No, I need a file." He stepped into the elevator, his reflection fractured in the mirrored walls. For once, the image of the immaculate CEO looked hollow. By the time he reached his office, night had settled over Denver, the city glowing faintly beneath the storm. Alexander sat at his desk, the city's lights blurring through snow-streaked glass. He couldn't stop seeing their faces. Two boys in threadbare coats, one clutching the coin he had once pressed into Julia's hand. The door clicked. Dana appeared again, hesitant. "The investigator will meet you tomorrow. Private, discreet." "Good." He waved her off, but his voice softened. "Thank you." When she left, he leaned back, staring at the ceiling. The silence pressed heavier than ever. He pulled open the drawer where he kept the empty leather box, the one that had once held the coin. He set it on the desk, the indentation inside mocking him. His phone buzzed. A message from the investigator's office. "We'll begin tracing Julia Parker. Expect updates within 24 hours. Alexander exhaled shakily. He whispered the name aloud, tasting regret in every syllable. Julia. That night, sleep refused him. He paced the length of his penthouse. Denver's skyline spread like a frozen sea beyond the windows. Memories flooded in. The softness of her laughter, the tremor in her voice when she said, "I'm pregnant." And his own cruel reply, "I don't want to be a father." By morning, his eyes were red, his tie slightly crooked. For the first time, he didn't care. The investigator called just before noon. "Mr. Carter, we have information." Alexander gripped the phone so tightly his knuckles blanched. "Tell me." She left New York shortly after your breakup. Records show she relocated to Colorado. Small towns. She raised twin boys, Thomas and Benjamin, on her own. No record of support, no mention of a father. The names echoed like thunder. Thomas, Benjamin. Alexander's voice caught. And their age? 9. The line went silent for a long beat. Alexander closed his eyes. The truth had arrived, not in whispers or suspicion, but in the undeniable shape of their lives. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. Keep digging. I want to know everything. Where they live, how she's managing. Don't stop until you have it all. Yes, sir. He ended the call and sank into his chair, staring out at the storm. The city stretched beneath him, miles of steel, glass, and profit he had built with relentless drive. But for the first time it all felt like ash. Because none of it could erase what he had done. None of it could bring back the years Julia spent alone, or the childhood of 2 boys who never knew their father. As snow thickened outside, Alexander Carter realized his empire meant nothing compared to the truth he had just uncovered, and in that moment he swore to himself he would not run again. The storm had quieted, leaving Denver blanketed in a hush of white. Alexander sat rigid in the leather seat of his car, the investigator's file heavy in his lap. He had driven all night after the call, restless, haunted. When the envelope finally arrived at dawn, he opened it with trembling hands. Inside were photographs, grainy shots of a small cottage buried in snow, smoke rising from the chimney. A woman in a worn coat, her hair tied back, carried groceries up the path. Even through the blur of distance, Alexander knew her. Julia. Time had etched lines on her face, but the strength in her posture was unmistakable. And then there were the boys. 2 identical figures racing through the snow, throwing clumps of powder at each other, laughter frozen midair in the captured frames. Thomas and Benjamin. The investigator's notes were blunt. She works odd jobs in town, barely making ends meet. No record of family support. Refuses government assistance whenever possible. Pride keeps her going. Alexander's throat tightened as he flipped to the last page. Address: Silver Pine, Colorado. Population: 2,300. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling of the car. He had built towers of glass and steel, signed contracts worth billions, yet here was the one truth money could not erase. Julia had survived without him. His sons had grown without him. He whispered their names aloud, letting them settle on his tongue. Thomas, Benjamin. The syllables ached, foreign and yet deeply his. Later that day, he walked the sterile hallway of a private clinic, his footsteps echoing off polished tile. The DNA test was quick, discreet. A swab, a signature, a request for silence. He told himself it was procedure, but his heart hammered as though awaiting a sentence. That night, snow fell again. Alexander stood by the hospital window, staring out as the city lights blurred behind the frosted glass. His phone buzzed on the sill. The results had arrived. With trembling hands, he opened the email. Probability of paternity: 99.9%. The words blurred. He pressed a palm against the glass, breath fogging the window. They were his. Every denial, every cruel word from that night in New York, undone in an instant. God, forgive me, he whispered. But forgiveness would not come from heaven. It would have to come from Julia, and from the boys who had lived 9 years believing their father was only a shadow. He sank into the chair by the window, head in his hands. The truth weighed more than any empire. He had spent years mastering markets, crushing rivals, winning every deal placed before him. But this was a reckoning he did not know how to face. In his mind, he heard Julia's voice again. You don't want to be a father. And his own reply, sharp and final, no, I don't. He had built his empire on those words, and now, with snow swirling outside like silent judgment, Alexander Carter realized everything he had built meant nothing compared to the family he had denied. For the first time in decades, he felt the sting of real loss. Not financial, not professional, human. And he knew, if there was to be redemption, it would begin not in his towers, but in the small snowbound cottage where Julia lived with Thomas and Benjamin. The morning air was sharp, carrying the scent of pine and smoke as Alexander drove through the foothills of Colorado. Each mile away from Denver's skyline stripped him of armor, power suits, boardrooms, titles. Ahead lay Silver Pine, a quiet town buried in snow, the place where Julia had raised the sons he had never known. The investigator's directions led him down a narrow road lined with wooden fences and sagging mailboxes. He slowed when he saw it, a small cottage tucked into the hillside, its roof sagging under fresh snow. A crooked porch light flickered faintly, and firewood was stacked unevenly by the door. He parked at the edge of the property, his breath fogging the windshield. For a long time, he didn't move, just stared at the cottage. Fear knotted his chest. Fear of rejection, of facing Julia's eyes after 9 years, of hearing the truth he already knew, that he had broken something that could never fully heal. But before he could step out, the front door opened. 2 boys tumbled into the yard, chasing each other through knee-deep snow. Their laughter carried on the cold wind, bright and unguarded. Alexander's hand gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles blanched. Thomas tripped, falling with a grunt. Benjamin immediately stopped, helping him up with clumsy care. The bond between them was instinctive, seamless. Brothers, twins, stronger together. Watching them, Alexander felt a sharp pang, a life he had missed, moments that should have been his to witness. The door creaked again. Julia stepped onto the porch, pulling her coat tight around her. Even from a distance, Alexander could see the weariness in her stance. She called the boys inside. Her voice firm but gentle. They obeyed instantly, racing past her into the warm glow of the cottage. She lingered for a moment, gazing out at the snow as if lost in thought. The same dark hair, the same profile he had traced with his fingers years ago, but her eyes, when she finally turned, were tired. Tired of winters, tired of carrying everything alone. Alexander's chest ached. He reached for the car door handle, then stopped. How could he just walk up there? How could he tell her, after all these years, that he was ready now, that he wanted what he had once thrown away? He imagined her voice, sharp with hurt. You don't get to choose when you're a father. You don't get to come back when it's convenient. The fear crushed him back into the seat. He couldn't barge into their lives like a storm, not after the words he had spoken that night in New York. Self-loathing gnawed at him. His empire felt laughable compared to the simple strength of Julia raising 2 boys in a wooden cottage. He thought of every late-night deal, every glass tower, every handshake that had defined him. None of it mattered. Not when weighed against the look on Julia's face if she saw him standing there now. So he stayed in the car, the engine idling softly. He watched her step back inside, closing the door against the cold. For a long time, he sat motionless, the snow burying his car tires. Then, finally, he whispered to himself, "Not yet, not like this." He put the car in reverse and drove slowly back down the road, leaving behind the glow of the cottage. But even as distance swallowed the little house, one truth clung to him tighter than the storm. If he wanted redemption, he would have to earn it, not with money, not with power, but with the one thing he had never offered before: presence. Alexander returned to Denver with the weight of the mountains pressing down on him. The city looked different now, harsher, emptier, its glass towers a reminder of everything he had gained at the cost of what truly mattered. He barely slept that night, haunted by the memory of Julia's tired eyes and the boys' laughter ringing through the snow. The next morning, he sat at his office window, coffee cooling untouched beside him. He stared at the skyline until his reflection blurred into the glass. His words from years ago echoed mercilessly. I don't want to be a father. He pressed his palms into his eyes. God, what have I done? The knock at his door startled him. Dana stepped in, holding a tablet. Sir, you've got 3 board meetings this afternoon, and the press is asking why you skipped last night's gala. Alexander waved it off. Cancel them. Dana blinked. All of them? Yes. His tone was sharper than he intended. He softened. Just tell them I'm unavailable. Family matters. Dana hesitated, searching his face. Understood. When she left, Alexander leaned back in his chair, gripping the armrests. He knew he couldn't keep circling the truth like a coward. He had to face Julia. He had to face his sons. But how? Barging in would only rip open old wounds. He closed his eyes, recalling the boys in the snow, the way the older one instinctively helped his brother up, the way they carried each other through hardship. He had no place in their lives yet. Not until he showed them he could be more than a shadow at the window. The next weekend, snow fell steadily as Alexander drove back to Silver Pine. This time, he parked farther down the road. He walked the last stretch, his polished shoes sinking into the powder, his breath fogging in the icy air. The cottage looked smaller up close, but warmer too. Smoke curled from the chimney, carrying the scent of pine. He knocked softly, heart hammering. The door opened. Julia stood there, her face pale with shock, her eyes narrowing the instant they found his. "What are you doing here?" Her voice was sharp, guarded. Alexander swallowed, his breath clouding in the air. "I came to help." Her laugh was bitter. "Help? After 9 years?" She stepped forward, blocking the doorway. "You don't get to say that word." "I know." His voice trembled. "I don't deserve it. But please, let me shovel the path, chop some wood, anything, not as a CEO, not as Alexander Carter, just as a man trying to make things right." Her eyes burned with anger and something deeper, pain that hadn't faded with time. She shook her head. "You don't get to walk back into our lives like nothing happened." Before Alexander could reply, small footsteps padded behind her. The boys peered out, their wide eyes flicking between their mother and the tall stranger on the porch. "Mom," one of them whispered, "is he really our father?" Julia's composure faltered. She turned toward them, lips trembling, and in her silence, the bent silver coin glinted faintly in the boy's small hand. Tears stung her eyes. She pressed a hand against the doorframe, her strength wavering for the first time, and Alexander, standing in the snow, felt the storm within him break wide open. The question hung in the air like frost. Is he really our father? Julia's hand tightened on the doorframe, her knuckles white. For years she had carried the burden alone, shielding her sons from a truth laced with betrayal. Now the boys stood before her, coin in hand, demanding an answer she wasn't ready to give. Her voice cracked. "Inside, boys." Thomas and Benjamin hesitated, their eyes fixed on Alexander. The older one whispered, "Mom, please." Julia's shoulders trembled. She pushed them gently back toward the fireplace's glow. They obeyed, reluctantly, casting one last look at the man in the snow before the door closed between them. Alexander remained on the porch, snow piling on his broad shoulders, his red tie catching the wind. "Julia," he said softly, "I'm not here to make excuses. I'm here because I can't run anymore. Those boys, they're mine, and I will never forgive myself for abandoning them, or you." Her eyes flashed with fury. "Don't you dare say you were the one abandoned. You made your choice, Alexander. You looked me in the eye and said you didn't want to be a father. I carried that sentence through every winter, every hunger. Every night I prayed the boys wouldn't ask why their dad never came." Alexander's throat tightened. "And I've lived with that choice every day since. Do you think the towers, the millions, the so-called success, it ever filled the hole I left behind?" His voice broke. "I see it now. I was a coward, and I don't deserve forgiveness. But please, let me be present, even if it's only to shovel the snow or chop wood. I can't undo the past, Julia, but I can stand here now." Her lips trembled. Anger kept her upright, but the tears in her eyes betrayed her heart. "You don't understand what you're asking. If I let you back in, it won't just be me you'll hurt if you fail again. It'll be them." "I know," Alexander whispered, "and that terrifies me more than anything." Silence stretched. The only sound was the wind sweeping snow across the porch. Finally, Julia stepped back a fraction, opening the door just enough for him to see the glow of the fireplace inside. The boys sat close together, the bent coin resting between them like a secret too heavy for children. "Fine," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "If you want to prove you've changed, you start small. Chop that wood. Shovel that path. No promises, no declarations. Just action. And if you so much as make them cry, Alexander, I will shut this door forever." Relief surged through him, but he nodded solemnly. "Understood." He rolled up his sleeves, stepped off the porch, and grabbed the axe leaning against the woodpile. Each swing cracked through the night, splitting logs, echoing through the valley. Sweat mixed with snow on his brow, but he didn't stop. For once, it wasn't about deals or numbers. It was about showing them, that he was still here. Inside, Thomas and Benjamin watched through the frosted window, their small faces pressed to the glass. For the first time, they saw their father, not the CEO in the skyscraper, but a man willing to stand in the cold for them. And Julia, standing behind them, let a single tear fall as she whispered to herself, "Maybe this time, he'll stay." The fire crackled inside the cottage, casting warm light on the boys' faces as they pressed against the window. Outside, Alexander swung the axe again and again, each strike clean and steady. Wood split beneath his hands, fragments scattering into the snow. His breath came in clouds, his suit jacket discarded, his white shirt damp with sweat despite the winter chill. Benjamin whispered, "He's really doing it." Thomas, older by minutes but always the cautious one, frowned. "Anyone can chop wood." Yet his eyes didn't leave the figure in the yard, the tall man who looked so much like them. Julia stood behind them, arms crossed tightly. Every thud of the axe sent memories rushing back, the promises Alexander once made, the ones he broke with a single cruel sentence. She closed her eyes, hearing it again. "I don't want to be a father." But then, opening them, she saw him drop to his knees, gathering logs with hands raw and blistered. This wasn't the untouchable CEO she remembered. This was a man stripped of pride, humbled by regret. After an hour, Alexander stacked the last piece neatly by the door. He knocked softly, his shoulders slumped, snow clinging to his hair. Julia opened it a crack. He didn't step inside. He only said, "The wood's ready, path's clear, that's all." Her eyes searched his face. "Why are you really here?" His voice was low, steady. "Because those boys deserve a father who shows up, even if he has to earn his way in one step at a time." Behind her, Thomas held up the bent silver coin. "Mom, you always said this was from him." His voice wavered. "So, is he really our dad?" Julia's breath caught. Tears blurred her vision. She turned toward her sons, lips parting. But no words came. Benjamin stepped closer to Alexander, studying his face. He was small, but his eyes carried a wisdom no child should bear. "You look like us," he said softly, "and you sound like home." Julia covered her mouth, her composure unraveling. The coin slipped from Thomas's fingers and landed in the snow between them, gleaming faintly in the porch light. Alexander bent to pick it up, his hand shaking. He closed it gently, then held it out toward the boys. "This coin was a promise I once broke, but if you let me, I'll spend the rest of my life keeping it, for both of you." The boys stared at him, then at their mother. Julia's tears finally spilled. She whispered, voice trembling, "Yes, he's your father." The room seemed to exhale. The boys froze, the truth sinking in heavier than snow. Thomas's lips quivered. Then why wasn't he here? The question sliced through the air. Julia's shoulders collapsed under the weight of it. She couldn't answer. Not now, not yet. And Alexander, standing in the doorway with snow dripping from his hair, knew the hardest part was only beginning. Because being their father wasn't about proving he shared their blood, it was about proving he would never leave again. The cottage was silent, broken only by the crackle of firewood. Julia sat on the edge of the sofa, her face pale, her hands clenched together as if holding herself in place. Across from her, Alexander stood just inside the doorway, shoulders broad yet trembling under the weight of her gaze. The boys lingered close to the fireplace, uncertain, their eyes darting between mother and father. Thomas finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why weren't you here?" Alexander's chest tightened. He stepped closer but kept his tone gentle. "Because I was foolish. I thought money and success mattered more than love. I thought I could walk away and not look back. I was wrong, Thomas. So very wrong." Benjamin clutched the bent silver coin, his small fingers trembling. "Mom always said it belonged to our dad. Did you give it to her?" Alexander nodded slowly, his throat raw. "Yes. I gave it to her when I promised I'd never leave, and then I broke that promise." Julia's head snapped up, her voice sharp. "You did more than break a promise. You shattered a family before it even began." He didn't argue. His deep blue eyes stayed fixed on hers, filled with remorse. "I can't change what I did, Julia, but I can be here now. I can show you, and them, that I won't run again." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Benjamin tugged at his brother's sleeve and whispered something. Together, the boys crossed the room. They stopped a few feet from Alexander. Thomas lifted his chin, his young voice trembling but brave. "If you're really our dad, then prove it." The challenge hung heavy in the air. Alexander bent to one knee, meeting them at eye level. "I don't expect you to believe me today, but I'll show you, every day, that I'm here, if you'll let me." Thomas stared at him, uncertain. Benjamin's eyes softened first. He whispered, "Can you build a snowman with us tomorrow?" The request struck Alexander harder than any corporate deal ever had. He swallowed the lump in his throat and smiled faintly. "Yes, I'd be honored." Julia turned away, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. She had tried to shield the boys from pain, yet here they were, opening their hearts to the very man who had once broken hers. That night, after the boys had gone to bed, Alexander lingered by the fire, his presence awkward but steady. Julia finally faced him, her voice raw. "You can help with the wood, play in the snow, even make them laugh. But understand this, if you disappear again, you won't just break me this time, you'll break them." He met her gaze without flinching. "Then I'll stake my life on staying." The flames flickered, shadows dancing across the cottage walls. For the first time, Julia saw not the CEO from the headlines, but a man stripped bare, ashamed, humbled, desperate for a chance. And though her heart still ached, a small part of her dared to believe he might finally keep his word. The next morning, the boys woke early, rushing to the window at the first glimmer of daylight. Overnight, a fresh layer of snow had blanketed the cottage yard. Benjamin clutched the bent coin in his pocket as if it were a lucky charm, while Thomas pressed his forehead to the glass. "Do you think he'll really come back?" he whispered. Julia, already in the kitchen stirring oatmeal, hesitated. Her voice was steady, though her heart was anything but. "We'll see." Moments later, the crunch of footsteps came from the path outside. The boys darted to the door, pulling it open before she could stop them. There he was, Alexander Carter, tall and striking, his navy coat dusted with snow, his red tie tucked against the wind. He held a basket of groceries in one arm and 2 pairs of sturdy mittens in the other. "Good morning," he said, his deep voice carrying warmth that surprised even him. "I thought we could build that snowman." The boys' faces lit up, and Julia's defenses cracked just slightly at the sight. She stepped aside, allowing him in. Hours later, the yard echoed with laughter. Alexander knelt in the snow, rolling the base of the snowman while Thomas packed the middle and Benjamin carefully pressed sticks for arms. "Needs a hat," Alexander said, dusting his gloves. Benjamin giggled. "Use your tie." Alexander laughed, a sound unfamiliar, rusty. "I think I'll keep that where it is." He pulled off his own wool cap and set it on the snowman's head. "Perfect." Julia watched from the porch, her arms folded tightly against the cold. She hadn't heard her sons laugh like this in months. Against her will, her heart softened. But joy was fragile. That evening, as Alexander helped Benjamin into dry socks by the fire, headlights flashed through the window. A van idled on the road, cameras poking from the open side door. Paparazzi. Julia's face drained of color. "They found us." Alexander stood sharply, jaw tightening. He pulled the curtain closed. "I'll handle this." She spun toward him, furious. "This is exactly why I didn't want you here. Your world doesn't stay at the office. Alexander, it follows you like a storm." The boys looked up, confused, fear flickering in their young eyes. Alexander crouched to meet them, his voice calm but firm. "Don't worry. No one's coming inside, I promise." But outside, flashes sparked against the snow, headlines already writing themselves. CEO Alexander Carter spotted in small town with mystery family. That night, Julia sat stiffly at the kitchen table, her face pale with anger. "You can't bring your chaos into our lives. They deserve peace." Alexander's voice was low, steady. "Then I'll make sure they have it. I'll put up walls if I have to, call in favors, buy out every photographer in this state, but I won't walk away. Not again." Julia searched his eyes, torn between fury and the smallest spark of hope. "Words won't protect them. Actions will." He nodded. "Then watch me." And for the first time, she didn't tell him to leave. Snow fell in soft flakes the next morning, but the storm outside the cottage was nothing compared to the one raging in the media. Headlines blared from every newsstand in Denver. Millionaire CEO Alexander Carter hiding family in mountain town? Investors panicked. Reporters swarmed Silverpine. The quiet life Julia had built with Thomas and Benjamin was suddenly under siege. She slammed the paper onto the table, her voice sharp. "This is exactly what I feared. You've turned our lives into a circus." Alexander stood at the counter, his jaw tight, but his voice steady. "I never wanted them dragged into this, but I won't let the press define our story. You can't control them." "No," he admitted, his blue eyes burning with resolve. "But I can redirect them." That afternoon, he called a press conference on the steps of his Denver headquarters. Cameras flashed wildly as he stepped to the podium, navy suit sharp against the snow-filled sky. Julia and the boys stayed home, hidden, but his every word was meant for them. "I am Alexander Carter," he began, his deep voice carrying over the crowd. "And yes, I have spent time in Silverpine, not because of scandal, not because of distraction, but because I finally remembered what matters more than empires and profits: people, family, children who deserve warmth when winter comes." Reporters shouted questions, but he held up a hand. "Over 2 million American children live without proper coats, gloves, or heating every winter. That ends now. Today, I am launching the Winter Warmth Fund with an initial donation of $20 million. Every child deserves to be safe and warm, no matter how much or how little their parents earn." The crowd erupted in noise, some skeptical, some moved. Investors texted frantically. But Alexander didn't waver. For once, he wasn't speaking for shareholders. He was speaking for Thomas, for Benjamin, for Julia. Back at the cottage, Julia watched the broadcast on the old television, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She didn't want to believe him, not after years of silence, but there was something different in his eyes. Less pride, more purpose. Benjamin whispered, Mom, he's helping kids like us. Thomas, older but more guarded, muttered, or maybe it's just for show. Julia couldn't answer. Her heart warred with itself. That night, Alexander returned to the cottage, his shoulders weary but his expression calm. Julia met him at the door. "Do you think throwing millions at the problem makes up for the years you weren't here?" He shook his head. "No. Money can't fix what I broke, but it can keep other children from suffering like ours did. This isn't redemption. It's responsibility." Her breath caught. She wanted to fight him, to push him away again. But the fire in his words burned past her defenses. For the first time, she wondered if he was telling the truth. Later, as the boys drifted to sleep by the fireplace, Thomas stirred, his voice drowsy. "Good night, Dad." Alexander froze. The word hit him like a hammer and a blessing all at once. He whispered back, his voice trembling, "Good night, son." And for the first time in 9 years, he allowed himself to believe he could belong. Christmas Eve settled over Silver Pine, the valley glowing with strings of lights strung across wooden fences and frosted rooftops. Inside the cottage, the fire burned bright, filling the room with warmth that no wealth could ever buy. Julia busied herself in the kitchen, her movements sharp and purposeful, though her heart was tangled in knots. Thomas and Benjamin crouched near the hearth, whispering to each other. The bent silver coin lay on the rug between them. Thomas traced its faded initials with one finger. If he really means what he says, he'll stay. He won't disappear again. Benjamin clutched the coin close to his chest. "I think he will. He came back for us." Alexander stepped in from the cold, snow dusting his broad shoulders. In his hands he carried 2 small packages, wrapped simply in brown paper and twine. He set them gently beneath the little tree they had decorated with popcorn garlands and paper stars. The boys looked up, curiosity sparking in their eyes. "Presents?" Benjamin asked. Alexander smiled softly. "Not the kind you're used to. Something better." He knelt, offering the packages. The boys tore the twine, revealing a pair of leather gloves, sturdy and warm. Inside, each was lined with soft wool, initials carefully engraved, T and B. Thomas slipped his on, flexing his fingers. Benjamin stared at his initials stitched into the lining, eyes glistening. "You made these for us?" "I had them made," Alexander said, voice trembling, "so you'd never have to face another winter with cold hands. And to remind you, I'll never let go of yours again." Silence filled the room. The fire popped, snow tapped against the windows, and Julia's breath caught in her throat. She turned away, wiping at her eyes before anyone could see. The boys rushed forward, wrapping their arms around Alexander's neck. For a moment he couldn't breathe, not from lack of air, but from the sheer weight of their embrace. His hands shook as he held them close, his chest rising with a sob he couldn't contain. Julia stood in the doorway, watching. Years of pain and betrayal still lived in her heart, but so did the truth. He was trying. He was humbling himself, not with money or grand gestures, but with presence. Later that night, as the boys slept soundly in their small room, Julia sat by the fire. Alexander sat across from her, exhaustion in his eyes but a steady calm in his voice. "I can't undo what I said, Julia. I can't erase the winters you carried alone, but I can promise you this. Those boys will never doubt again that they have a father, and if you'll let me, I'll stand beside you too, not as the CEO, just as Alexander, the man who never stopped loving you." Her eyes glistened in the firelight. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she whispered, "If you stay, if you prove this isn't just another promise, maybe someday we'll find our way back." The flames crackled between them, but something warmer flickered to life as well. Fragile, tentative, but real. And, for the first time in nearly a decade, Julia allowed herself to believe that healing might be possible. Winter loosened its grip on Silver Pine slowly, trading blizzards for soft flurries that melted into the thawing earth. Months had passed since Alexander Carter first stood on Julia's porch with snow in his hair and regret in his eyes. Now, on a clear Saturday afternoon, the sound of laughter carried across a frozen lake just beyond town. Thomas wobbled forward on skates too big for his feet. "I'm gonna fall!" he shouted, arms flailing. Alexander's deep voice echoed with warmth. "Not if I've got you!" He glided beside his son, strong hands steadying him. Thomas's grin broke wide as he found balance, the two of them moving in sync across the ice. On the far end of the lake, Benjamin practiced clumsy turns, Julia watching from the snowy bank. She pulled her coat tighter, her breath forming white clouds, but her eyes followed Alexander with quiet wonder. He wasn't the man who once chose empire over family. He wasn't the man who broke her heart with cold words. He was different now, present, humbled, steady. The boys shouted for him again, their laughter ringing like bells across the valley. Alexander's gaze lifted to Julia, their eyes meeting across the ice. She didn't smile fully, not yet, but there was no anger in her face, only something softer, something that might, one day, be love again. When the sun dipped low, casting golden light across the snow, Alexander called the boys in. They huddled together on the bank, cheeks red, gloves damp. He pulled them close, leather mittens engraved T&B tucked safely in their pockets. "Proud of you," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "Both of you." Julia knelt beside them, her hand brushing Alexander's as she adjusted Benjamin's scarf. Neither pulled away. That evening, as they walked back toward the cottage, the boys raced ahead, leaving Alexander and Julia trailing in silence. The snow crunched beneath their boots, the path glowing faintly under lantern light. Alexander spoke quietly, the weight of truth in every word. "The board still respects me. The empire's still mine, but it doesn't matter anymore. Thomas and Benjamin, they're my greatest achievement." Julia's breath caught. For years, she had prayed not for riches, not for comfort, but for this, for a father who would see their boys, not as burdens, but as blessings. When they reached the porch, the twins darted inside, laughter spilling into the warm cottage. Julia paused at the doorway, turning to him. "You stayed." He met her eyes, blue and steady. "I told you I would." She studied him for a moment, then nodded softly, as if something long locked in her heart had shifted, sighed. The fire crackled, the boys' voices filling the home with life, and for the first time in nearly a decade, Alexander Carter stepped inside, not as a guest, not as a stranger, but as a father. The empire he had built would continue, the headlines would fade, but this family, was the legacy he would protect until his last breath. As laughter echoed through the snowy hills, Alexander knew redemption had finally found him.